What happens when a routine live TV interview takes an unexpected turn, and a Hollywood star decides, in real time, that she's not going to play along? It doesn't come with a warning. There's no dramatic buildup, no flashing signal to tell viewers that something is about to shift. One moment, it's a familiar daytime conversation. The next, the tone changes, subtle but undeniable. And suddenly, what millions are watching isn't just an interview anymore. It's a moment. That's exactly what unfolded when Amanda Seyfried appeared on live television alongside veteran host Joy Behar. What began as a standard promotional segment slowly transformed into something far more revealing. An exchange that caught audiences off guard, not because it was loud or explosive, but because of how controlled, measured, and quietly firm it became. Before we break down what really happened and why it mattered, make sure you subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes the most important moments on live TV aren't the ones everyone expects. They're the ones no one sees coming. Amanda Seyfried had built her career on versatility and restraint. From musical performances to intense dramatic roles, she was known for letting her work speak louder than her public persona. In interviews, she often came across as thoughtful, grounded, and careful with her words. Not evasive, but deliberate. She didn't chase controversy, and she rarely found herself at the center of it. Joy Behar, on the other hand, had spent decades navigating exactly those kinds of moments. As a longtime co-host on one of America's most recognizable daytime talk shows, her style was direct, confident, and sometimes disarming. She had a reputation for asking the questions others might avoid. Questions that could shift a conversation from comfortable to complicated in an instant. Put those two personalities together, and the expectation is simple. A lively, engaging discussion with a few sharp edges, but nothing that crosses the line. After all, daytime television thrives on balance, keeping things interesting without letting them spiral out of control. But live TV has a way of testing that balance. The set that day looked exactly as it always did. Bright lights, a welcoming audience, and a panel ready to guide the conversation. Amanda Seyfried walked out with a composed smile, greeted the hosts, and took her seat. There was no visible tension, no hint that anything unusual was about to unfold. The conversation began where most interviews do, safe ground. Her latest project, her approach to acting, a few light-hearted remarks. Seyfried answered with ease, her tone calm and steady. She engaged with the panel, responded thoughtfully, and maintained the kind of presence viewers had come to expect from her. For a while, everything followed the script. But live television doesn't always stay on script. There's an unspoken rhythm to these interviews. Hosts guide the conversation, guests respond, and the segment moves forward with a kind of invisible structure. But every now and then, that rhythm shifts. It's not always obvious at first, but it's there. A slight pause, a change in posture, a question that lands just a little differently than the ones before it. That's when things start to change. Joy Behar leaned in, not dramatically, not aggressively, but with intention. It was the kind of shift only noticeable if you were paying close attention. The kind that signals a conversation is about to move beyond the surface. Amanda Seyfried remained composed. She listened carefully, her expression neutral but attentive. There was no interruption, no immediate reaction, just a quiet awareness that the tone was evolving. And in that moment, the space between question and answer began to matter more than the words themselves. Because in live television, timing is everything. There are no retakes, no edits, no opportunity to soften a moment once it's already happened. Every glance, every pause, every choice of words is broadcast exactly as it unfolds. And when a question pushes just a little further than expected, the response can define the entire exchange. For viewers at home, it might have still felt like a normal interview. But in the studio, the shift was becoming clearer. The energy was tightening, not tense, not uncomfortable yet, but focused. Like something was building. This is where the difference between a routine segment and a memorable moment begins to take shape. Not through conflict, but through contrast. Two people, two perspectives, and a conversation that's no longer entirely predictable. Amanda Seyfried didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. But there was a subtle change in her demeanor. A steadiness that suggested she was choosing her words even more carefully now. Joy Behar, experienced as ever, continued forward. Her role was to ask, to probe, to keep the conversation moving. And sometimes that means stepping into territory that isn't entirely comfortable. That's the risk and the reality of live television. Because once a certain line is approached, there's no guarantee how it will play out. And on that day, that line was closer than anyone realized. The audience sat quietly watching. The cameras kept rolling. And between one question and the next, something shifted just enough to be felt, but not yet fully understood. Amanda Seyfried was still composed. Joy Behar was still in control of the conversation. But the dynamic between them had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make one thing clear. This interview was no longer just routine. And what happened next would turn a simple conversation into a moment people wouldn't forget. By the time Amanda Seyfried took her seat on The View, the interview may have looked routine. But the context surrounding it was anything but simple. In the weeks leading up to her appearance, Seyfried had been navigating a phase in her career that demanded more visibility than ever before. Her recent projects had drawn attention not just for their performances, but for the themes they explored. Topics that often invited deeper questions about the industry, personal choices, and the pressures placed on actors in the public eye. She had handled press tours before. She understood the rhythm: promote the work, share insights, stay composed. But with increased attention comes a different kind of scrutiny. Interviews become less about surface-level promotion and more about interpretation. What's said, what's implied, and sometimes what's deliberately left unsaid. Amanda Seyfried had built a reputation for being thoughtful in those moments. She didn't rush answers. She didn't overexpose. And perhaps most importantly, she maintained a sense of control over how much of herself she chose to share. That approach had served her well. But not every interview environment operates the same way. Across the table, Joy Behar brought a completely different dynamic. Decades of live television had shaped her instincts. She knew how to read a moment, when to push, and when to hold back. But she was also known for stepping into uncomfortable territory, asking questions that cut through prepared answers and forced a more immediate, unfiltered response. It's what made her segments compelling, and sometimes unpredictable. The format of The View only amplified that unpredictability. Unlike one-on-one interviews, the panel setup creates multiple entry points into a conversation. Different perspectives, different tones, and a constant shift in focus. For a guest, it means staying alert, not just to one host, but to the entire table. On that day, the conversation initially moved with ease. Amanda Seyfried spoke about her work with clarity and confidence. She reflected on her roles, the challenges of portraying complex characters, and the balance between personal life and professional demands. The audience responded well. There were moments of laughter, nods of agreement, and the kind of engagement that signals a segment is going exactly as planned. But within that flow, there were subtle signals that the discussion might not stay entirely within safe boundaries. Joy Behar's questions, while still grounded in the topic at hand, began to carry a sharper edge. Not inappropriate, not out of place, but more probing. The kind of questions that require more than a rehearsed response. Amanda noticed. Her posture remained relaxed, but her focus sharpened. She listened more intently, taking slightly longer pauses before answering. It wasn't hesitation, it was precision. A careful consideration of how to respond without losing control of the narrative. Because in live television, control isn't about dominating the conversation. It's about maintaining clarity under pressure. As the segment progressed, the topics began to shift, gradually moving away from strictly professional territory into areas that touched on perception, public image, and the expectations placed on actors by both the industry and the audience. These are the moments where interviews can evolve or unravel. Joy Behar, drawing from years of experience, guided the conversation with a steady hand. But there was an intentionality behind her approach now. She wasn't just asking questions, she was steering towards something more revealing. For viewers at home, it may have still felt like a natural progression. But for those paying closer attention, the tone was tightening. Amanda Seyfried continued to respond with composure. She didn't deflect. She didn't shut down. Instead, she engaged, carefully, thoughtfully, while maintaining a clear boundary around how far the conversation could go. That balance is difficult to sustain, especially when the questions begin to narrow in. The studio atmosphere reflected that shift. The audience, once more reactive, grew quieter. The other hosts, while still part of the discussion, seemed to give more space to the exchange unfolding between Seyfried and Behar. It wasn't tense yet, but it was focused. There's a moment in many live interviews where everything hinges on what comes next. a point where the conversation can either ease back into familiar territory or push forward into something more uncertain. That moment was approaching. Joy Behar adjusted slightly in her seat, signaling a transition. Her next question wasn't rushed. It was deliberate, framed in a way that connected to the ongoing discussion, but carried a deeper implication. Amanda Seyfried listened closely, and in that brief pause before she responded, something became clear. She understood exactly where the conversation was heading. This is where experience meets instinct. Because seasoned actors don't just respond to questions, they anticipate them. They recognize patterns, tone shifts, and the subtle cues that indicate when an interview is about to move beyond the expected. Amanda Seyfried had reached that point. She remained calm, composed, but there was a noticeable stillness now, a sign that she was preparing for something more direct. The kind of question that doesn't just invite an answer, but demands one. Around her, the studio held steady. Cameras continued to roll. The audience watched, unaware that they were seconds away from witnessing a moment that would define the entire segment. Joy Behar leaned forward slightly. The conversation had narrowed. The setup was complete. And just as everything aligned, the timing, the tone, the context, the interview crossed into a space where every word would carry more weight than before. What happened next wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be chaotic, but it would be unmistakable. Because sometimes the most powerful moments on live television don't come from conflict. They come from the exact moment someone decides how far they're willing to go, and where they choose to draw the line. The question, when it finally came, didn't sound explosive. There was no raised voice, no dramatic phrasing, just a carefully worded sentence delivered by Joy Behar with the kind of calm precision that only comes from years of live television experience. But the impact wasn't in how it was said. It was in what it implied. For a fraction of a second, the studio seemed to hold its breath. Amanda Seyfried didn't react immediately. She didn't interrupt, didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't look away. Instead, she stayed completely still, her expression neutral, her posture steady, her eyes focused. It was the kind of pause that doesn't feel long on paper, but on live television, stretches just enough to be noticed. The audience, which had been softly engaged moments earlier, grew quiet. The background energy, the small movements, the subtle reactions, seemed to settle all at once. Joy Behar held her gaze, waiting. No one spoke. Amanda Seyfried finally inhaled, almost imperceptibly, and then responded. Her voice was calm, measured. There was no trace of defensiveness, no attempt to deflect the question with humor or redirect it entirely. But there was something else, something unmistakable in her tone. Control. She addressed the question directly, but on her own terms. Each word felt deliberate, chosen not just to answer, but to define the boundaries of the conversation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't challenge the host outright. But the clarity of her response shifted the dynamic instantly. It was no longer just a question and answer. It was a statement, a quiet, firm recalibration of where the conversation could go, and where it would stop. Joy Behar, still composed, listened without interruption. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but there was a subtle shift, an acknowledgement that the response had landed differently than expected. Amanda continued, expanding just enough to make her point clear, but not so much that she lost control of the narrative. She didn't over-explain. She didn't retreat. She held her ground. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was intentional. For a moment, no one at the table stepped in. The other hosts, usually quick to add commentary or pivot the discussion, seemed to sense that this exchange needed space. The audience remained quiet, attentive, aware that something significant had just unfolded. On a recorded show, this might have been edited, trimmed, smoothed out to maintain a certain flow. But this was live. Every second remained intact. Joy Behar responded next, her tone still professional, but noticeably more measured. She didn't press further, not immediately. Instead, she acknowledged the response, offering a brief follow-up that softened the edge of the moment without undoing it. It was a subtle shift, but an important one, because the balance of the conversation had changed. Amanda Seyfried nodded slightly, maintaining her composure. There was no visible tension in her expression, no sign of lingering discomfort. If anything, she appeared more grounded, more certain of her position within the conversation. What made the moment stand out wasn't confrontation in the traditional sense. There were no raised voices, no overlapping arguments, no visible frustration. But there was a clear line drawn and recognized. And in live television, that can be more powerful than anything else. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every detail. The lighting, the set, the audience, everything remained the same. And yet, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The conversation moved forward, but not in the same way. There was a new awareness now, a recalibration among everyone at the table. Questions that followed felt more measured. Responses carried a slightly different weight. The spontaneity of the moment had given way to something more deliberate. But that single exchange lingered. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was real, unscripted, unedited, and impossible to ignore. Amanda Seyfried had done something that's difficult to execute under the pressure of live television. She had answered a challenging question without losing composure, without escalating the situation, and without allowing the narrative to move beyond her control. Joy Behar, equally experienced, recognized the shift and adjusted accordingly. It was a moment defined not by conflict, but by awareness. Two professionals navigating an unexpected turn in real time. And for viewers watching at home, it stood out precisely because of what it wasn't. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't sensational. It was controlled, measured, and quietly decisive. As the segment continued, the show returned to a more familiar rhythm. Lighter questions, easier transitions, a gradual easing of the tension that had briefly taken hold. But the moment had already happened. It couldn't be undone. And it didn't need to be. Because sometimes the most telling moments on live television aren't the ones that dominate the entire segment. They're the ones that change it, even briefly. The ones that reveal something beneath the surface. And for those watching closely, this was one of them. A single question, a measured response, and a shift that everyone could feel, even if no one said it out loud. In the seconds that followed, the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The studio didn't erupt. There was no audible gasp, no dramatic reaction from the audience. But the energy had changed. The kind of change that settles quietly into a room and lingers, even as the conversation moves on. Joy Behar, seasoned and composed, did what experienced hosts do in moments like this. She recalibrated. Her next words came carefully, her tone slightly softer, guiding the discussion back toward safer ground without drawing attention to the shift that had just occurred. It was a professional recovery. Smooth, controlled. But the moment itself hadn't disappeared. Amanda Seyfried remained steady in her seat, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. If anything, she appeared more grounded now, like someone who had quietly asserted control and had no need to reinforce it further. The other hosts at the table seemed to sense it too. There was a brief hesitation before jumping back in. A slight pause where, normally, overlapping commentary might have filled the space. Instead, the conversation resumed with a bit more care, a bit more awareness of where the boundaries now stood. For the audience in the studio, the reaction was restrained but attentive. A few nods, a few exchanged glances. Nothing overt, but enough to show that they had registered what had just happened. And at home, viewers were experiencing something even more rare. An unedited moment. No cuts, no retakes, no opportunity to reshape the narrative after the fact. That's the nature of live television. And it's what gives moments like this their lasting impact. As the segment continued, the tone gradually returned to familiar territory. Lighter questions resurfaced. The pacing picked up again. Smiles returned, and the rhythm of daytime television reestablished itself. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Because once a moment like that happens, it changes how everything that follows is perceived. Amanda Seyfried's responses, even to simpler questions, now carried a different weight. Viewers weren't just listening, they were watching more closely. Not for conflict, but for clarity. For consistency. And she delivered exactly that. Composed. Measured. Consistent. There was no attempt to revisit the earlier exchange. No effort to turn it into something bigger than it was. And that restraint in itself became part of the story. Joy Behar, to her credit, didn't push back into the same territory. She allowed the conversation to move forward, maintaining the flow of the show while respecting the boundary that had been set. It was a quiet understanding, unspoken but clear. By the time the segment wrapped, the atmosphere had fully stabilized. The audience applauded. The hosts thanked their guest. And Amanda Seyfried exited the stage the same way she had entered, calm, composed, and in control. But the moment didn't end there. Because live television doesn't just exist in the moment. It continues afterward through clips, discussions, and interpretations. Within hours, viewers began revisiting the exchange. Not for drama, but for detail. The pause before the answer. The tone of the response. The way the conversation shifted immediately afterward. It wasn't about who won the exchange. It was about how it was handled. Media coverage reflected that nuance. Rather than framing it as a confrontation, many discussions focused on the professionalism displayed on both sides. The balance between asking difficult questions and responding to them without escalation. And that's what gave the moment its staying power. In an era where loud, sensational exchanges often dominate attention, this stood out for the opposite reason. It was controlled, intentional, real. For Amanda Seyfried, it reinforced something that had already been part of her public image: thoughtfulness under pressure. The ability to engage without overexposing, to respond without reacting. For Joy Behar, it was another example of the risks and realities of live interviewing. Asking the question that matters, while accepting that the answer may not follow the expected path. And for viewers, it was a reminder of why moments like this still resonate. Because they're unscripted, they're unpredictable, and they reveal something genuine about the people involved and about the dynamics of live conversation itself. Even now, the exchange continues to be referenced not as a dramatic clash, but as a case study in composure. A moment where nothing spiraled out of control, yet everything shifted. And that's what makes it memorable. Not the volume, not the conflict, but the precision, the timing, the decision made in real time to hold a line, and the recognition of that line by everyone else in the room. If you appreciate deep dives into real, unfiltered television moments like this, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that unfold quietly, right in front of us, and stay with us long after the cameras stop rolling.